Hello everyone, my name is Pat Cadwell and I'm a lecturer at Dublin City University. I'm talking to you here today though as a member of a research network called Interact, and Interact stands for the International Network on Crisis Translation. So you can probably tell from the name that our focus is on translation and on the written word. However, I think some of the needs in a crisis setting for translation and interpreting are similar, so I've included interpreting in some parts of my talk. What I'm going to talk about today is essentially giving you some of the problems and issues that bring somebody like me to want to be part of a research network like Interact. I'll briefly outline the network itself and the structure. I'll tell you that we focus some of our efforts on training, and I'll explain why our interest is on training in particular. And I'll give you two examples of some training resources that we've been working on within the network. So some of these issues have been dealt with already today, but I think they're worth restating. Why should we care about language and culture in a crisis setting? Well, research has shown that if you don't take care of these things, people may misunderstand risks, people will make poor decisions, the operations will be less effective, you're hindering the participation of those who are affected. If you hinder that participation, you're cutting off very precious sources of local knowledge. As people have argued earlier on, you could say it's a basic humanitarian right to have information accessible in your own language and culture. Also, we believe it's ethically right, and research has shown this. And finally, I think another big reason why we should be interested in language and culture in crisis settings is because probably we are all going to face more crises in the future, especially research is indicating in large, diverse urban settings. So it's something we all need to think about. Of course, interlingual translation and interpreting is not the only way to address language and culture, and other research is looking, for example, at language learning in crisis settings. It's also quite common to have a lingua franca, so many NGOs will establish 2 or 3 languages which they use predominantly in their work. It's also possible to try to simplify these dominant languages so that they can be more accessible to more people. And some researchers are in fact abandoning traditional language itself and trying to focus on pictographs and symbols and so on in crisis settings. I think these are all valid approaches. They all have their pros and their cons, but my interest in particular is in translation, but also in translation and interpreting within our network. There is a lot of research that has been done to show that translation and interpreting have been part of various crisis settings. And I've put some references to various contexts for you up on the slides there. The ones on the left-hand side are mostly arising from an initial earthquake disaster. And then on the right-hand side, these contexts are more to do with migrations and movements of people. So, researchers have looked at translation and interpreting in a lot of different settings. What can we say are some of the common patterns or some of the themes which have come out of this research? Well, one thing that would come across quite clearly is, and it has been mentioned several times today, is that the efforts at translation and interpreting in a crisis are typically quite ad hoc. They may be at least under-coordinated or uncoordinated, and they're often carried out by groups of volunteers working locally, and often again without formal training. So what you see across the research is a picture of people doing great work under very difficult circumstances and many, many constraints, but often in their own kind of pockets, without much ability to kind of share lessons and to gain from understandings that people who've done similar work in different settings have earned. So, why is this happening? Again, a lot of the reasons have already been talked about. So why are things so ad hoc or so locally focused? Well, for example, the pool of trained professional interpreters and translators is small, especially for some of the languages that are needed in recent crises. And even where there is an infrastructure for professional translation and interpreting, it can be very difficult to ensure that the resources are matched with the needs in time and in an appropriate and ethical way. But there are other reasons why these features have occurred. We shouldn't say, for example, that just because something is voluntary, it is not professional. Much of the research has shown that professional interpreters and translators act as volunteers. What I would say, though, is that in these crisis settings, it isn't that unusual for the distinction between translation and interpreting to become a bit blurred. And we have observed that some people who are trained as professional translators may be required to interpret, and vice versa. So these are the problems that we're facing in our research network. As I said, this is a research network that I'm a member of, but it is being led by Sharon O'Brien at my university, Dublin City University. It's an EU-funded research and innovation staff exchange. So this is a type of funding mechanism that allows people to go on secondment, meet each other, share knowledge, and work together. So Sharon has brought about a very diverse group of academics, non-governmental organizations and technology industry partners from across the globe, and we've been working together since 2017 on the topic of crisis translation. So we have about just under 1 year left of funding. Within the network, we've been focusing on pretty much 5 major topics, and again, many of these have already been mentioned today, but I'll just restate them to show that we're all working towards many of the same aims. Our first work package is on policy, because things rarely happen unless there's a policy. We are looking at simplification, that idea of if there's a lingua franca, trying to make it more accessible and more understandable to other people. We're looking at technology solutions, so for example, trying to develop machine translation engines specifically for various types of crisis settings. We're also looking, of course, at ethics, because as you've seen from the speakers earlier on today, ethical issues run right across all the topics that we've been talking about so far. And the one that I've highlighted there is training, because this is the work package I've been mostly involved in. Why should we focus on training? Again, some of these have already been said, but one big issue is accountability. So if people aren't trained, it can be difficult to understand how to be accountable, or if they even should be accountable. Similarly, if efforts are always uncoordinated and ad hoc, they're really difficult to sustain, and they're really difficult to expand. And also there can be wasted efforts. As I said, sometimes people are working in their own little pockets without being able to share knowledge or lessons learned. I think one of the focuses of our training package is on this concept of coordination, and that's something that I'd like to come back to a little bit later on, and it's also one of the big reasons why I wanted to speak here. I think we need to do more to coordinate and to cooperate on these various efforts that are happening throughout Europe. There's another very simple reason why you should focus on training. People are asking for it. So crisis translators and interpreters, we've surveyed them as part of our research in the network, and they say they have concerns and they want training. Similarly, the people who use crisis translation and interpreting have also said to us that they think there would be a benefit to receiving training themselves and to seeing more crisis translators and interpreters trained. So those are kind of the contextual features. Now I'm just going to talk about 2 resources that we've been working on within the research network. The first is a training resource designed for people who are actually going to work as crisis translators. So this is people on the ground who find themselves in a situation where they're volunteering in a local effort. These are typically people without any form of translation or interpreting training. They are not typically professionals. They are people who speak or understand certain languages and are being asked to translate or in a crisis. This particular training collaboration came about through our work with the New Zealand Red Cross. So we were working in New Zealand on our research, and the Red Cross approached us because they wanted to translate an earthquake planning guide for recent migrants living in the Wellington region of New Zealand. The goal of the project was not so much to create guides in different languages. The goal was to bring people in these migrant communities together to work and essentially to understand the new risks that they were exposed to by living in New Zealand. So the greater project was one of disaster resilience, and translation was a way to make people aware of the issues they faced and to bring them together to find culturally and linguistically appropriate ways to deal with that risk. Another very practical reason was the coordinator of this project had no experience in translation and she just wanted some help. So we in the Interact network, we developed a resource. It's a very quick training course in the basic principles of translation. So in 90 minutes, we try to cover just some ideas that would help somebody to work a little bit better, feeling a bit more supported, and to be able to work a little bit more ethically if they were asked to be a crisis translator. This training was used to train 45 citizens using 17 different languages in the Wellington region of New Zealand. Initially, my colleague Federico Federici and I delivered the training in person, but then it was continued by the coordinator of the overall project using voiced slides that we provided from the first training session. This collaboration is continuing 2 years later, and more translators are being trained. I think it's up to about 90 at this stage. Along the period of the 2 years of the project, we've also had this training material evaluated by various people who work, for example, in NGOs, or by people who have experience working as translators and linguistic volunteers. And we've been trying in kind of various iterations to improve the training and introduce the feedback that they gave us. Then this is another quite different course that we've been working on as part of the network. This is more the coordination focus that I mentioned. So we have developed some resources targeted at master's level students. The idea is that this training should be delivered within academic programs, postgraduate programs, as a module or as a part of a module. We are not training people to be translators or interpreters. We are training people to be able to be kind of language consultants or crisis coordinators from a language perspective in a humanitarian organization or in some form of crisis response. So again, this was developed firstly during our research time in New Zealand. We began by delivering the program at the University of Auckland. It's been delivered there twice in a master's program. We've delivered it at the University College London twice, and we've delivered it at my home university, Dublin City University, once. These universities are all academic partners in the research network. Just very briefly to tell you what the training involves, it's language independent. So the idea is not to teach language, not to teach translation, not to teach interpreting. We are trying to sensitize people to the issues that are important in a crisis translation or interpreting scenario. We give them especially, we hope, the skills that will be able to allow them to help others make good decisions. And the decisions that we want them to make are good decisions about the means of translation and interpreting, channels, the modes, and the personnel that might be required. And under all of this is a big focus on the ethical concerns that arise in a crisis setting. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say today, except for this last slide on the kind of the next steps that we hope to take. As you can imagine, we now have some resources which are going to be available at the end of the research project. As I said, we have just a little under 1 year left, so we will be releasing those once we have reached a final version. We also think it's very important to involve the professional translation and interpreting community in crisis and disaster response training. This may already be happening, but it's not happening sufficiently in many contexts. So one of the reasons I came here is to ask the community to think about becoming involved in training specifically in crisis response. And then, as other people have done, we're interested in hearing authentic voices. So people who have participated in crisis translation in particular. If any of you would like to share your stories with us, we'd be very glad to hear them. And I've included my email address at the end. Thank you very much.